The Little Mermaid, written by Hans Christian Andersen. Far out in the ocean, the water is as blue as the petals of the prettiest cornflower, and as clear as the purest glass. But it is very deep, deeper than any anchor can reach. You would have to stack a lot of church steeples on top of each other to get from the bottom to the surface. The sea people live down there. Now don't get the idea that there's only bare white sand at the bottom of the sea. No, you will find the strangest trees and plants whose stems and leaves are so supple that at the slightest movement of water they stir as if they were alive. Fish, large and small, dart among the branches just as birds up here fly through the air. The Sea King's castle stands at the deepest spot. Its walls are coral and its pointed, long windows are the clearest amber. The roof is made of mussel shells, which open and close as the water moves. It looks beautiful because in every shell there is a shiny pearl, and just one of them could be a great gem in a queen's crown. The Sea King had been a widower for many years, and his old mother kept house for him. She was a wise woman and proud of her noble lineage, so she wore 12 oysters on her tail. Other nobles could only have 6. But apart from this, she deserved a lot of credit, because she was so fond of the little sea princesses, her grandchildren. They were 6 delightful children, and the youngest was the prettiest of all. Her skin was as delicate and as clear as a rose petal, her eyes as blue as the deepest lake, but like her sisters, she didn't have any feet. Her body ended in a fishtail. All day long the children played in the castle, in the great halls where flowers grew out of the walls. When they opened the large amber windows, fish swam in, just as swallows up here fly in when we open ours. The fish swam right up to the little princesses, ate out of their hands, and let themselves be petted. Outside the castle was a large garden, with fiery red and dark blue trees. The fruit shone like gold, and the flowers looked like fire because their stems and leaves were constantly moving. The ground itself was the finest sand, but it was blue, like a sulphurous flame. Everything had a strange blue glow, and it was easier to believe that you were high up in the air, with the sky above and below, than to think that you were at the bottom of the sea. When the water was perfectly still, you could glimpse the sun, which looked like a purple flower, from whose calyx all the light streamed out. Each little princess had her own spot in the garden, where she could dig and plant as she wished. One princess shaped her little flower patch like a whale, another wanted hers to look like a small mermaid. But the youngest princess made her garden as round as the sun, and she only planted flowers that were red like the sun. She was a strange child, quiet and thoughtful. When her sisters decorated their gardens with the wondrous objects that they had taken from the sunken ships, She wanted only one thing apart from those rose-red flowers that looked like the distant sun. The beautiful marble statue of a handsome boy. He was carved out of that white, shiny stone and had ended up on the bottom of the sea in a shipwreck. Next to the statue she planted a rose-red weeping willow. It grew so splendidly, and its fresh branches hung over the statue towards the blue sandy bottom, where its shadows looked purple and moved just like the branches. It looked like the top branches and the roots were pretending to kiss each other. Nothing made the mermaid happier than to hear about the world of people above. She wanted her old grandmother to tell her everything she knew about the ships and the cities and the people and the animals. Everything seemed especially wonderful to her that up on earth the flowers had a smell. They didn't on the bottom of the sea, and that the forests were green and that the fish one saw among the branches could sing loudly and prettily. Grandmother called the small birds fish, otherwise the mermaids could not have understood her because they had never seen a bird. When you are 15, her grandmother said, you'll be allowed to go to the surface of the sea, sit on the rocks in the moonlight and watch the great ships sail by. And you'll see forests and cities too. The next year one of those sisters would be 15. The youngest sister still had to wait 5 years before she could venture up from the bottom of the ocean to see how things looked up there. Each sister promised to tell the others what she had seen and liked most on her first visit. Their grandmother had not told them enough, so there was a lot that they wanted to learn. No one yearned to go as much as the youngest mermaid, the one who had to wait the longest, and who was so quiet and thoughtful. On many nights she stood by the open window and looked up through the dark blue water where the fish flicked their fins and tails. She could see the moon and the stars. They were of course quite pale, but through the water they appeared much bigger than they do to our eyes. If a black cloud seemed to glide under the stars, she knew that either a whale was swimming above her, or a ship with many people on board was passing by. It probably did not occur to them that a beautiful little mermaid stood beneath them, stretching her white hands towards the ship's keel. The oldest princess turned 15 and swam to the surface. When she returned, she had hundreds of things to tell her sisters, but the best thing, she said, was to lie in the moonlight on a sandbank in the tranquil sea and look at the big city near the coast, where the lights blinked like hundreds of stars. Listen to the music and the hustle and bustle of carriages and people. See the many church steeples and spires, and hear the bells ring. Because the youngest sister couldn't go there, she longed all the more for it. How she listened! And when, later in the evening, she stood by the open window and looked up through the dark blue water, she thought about the big city and all the hustle and bustle, and believed that she could hear the church bells ring all the way down to where she was. A year later, the next sister got permission to go to the surface and swim wherever she wanted. She rose from the water just as the sun was setting, and she thought that was the most beautiful sight. The whole sky, she said, looked like gold, and the clouds actually, she couldn't even describe how beautiful they were. Red and violet sailed above her. Moving much faster, a flock of wild swans flew like a long white veil across the water towards the sun. She swam towards the sun, but it set, and its rose-red light vanished from the clouds and the surface of the sea. The next year the third sister went up. She was the most daring of them all, and swam up a wide river that ran into the sea. She saw beautiful green hills covered with grapevines. Castles and farms peeped through great forests. She heard how the birds sang, and the sun was so hot that she often had to dive under the surface to cool her burning face. In a small bay she ran into a group of children. They ran about, quite naked, splashing in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they were frightened and ran away. A little black animal came along. It was a dog, but she had never seen a dog before. It barked at her so frightfully that it scared her, and she headed for the open sea. But she would never forget the magnificent forest, the green hills and the nice children who could swim even though they did not have fish tails. The fourth sister wasn't so daring. She stayed in the middle of the wild ocean and said that right there was best of all. She could see for miles, and the sky above was like a big glass ball. She had seen ships, but they were far away. They had looked like seagulls. Bunny dolphins turned somersaults, and big whales squirted water through their nostrils, so it looked as if she was surrounded by hundreds of fountains. Then it was the fifth sister's turn. It so happened that her birthday was in the winter, and that was why she saw what none of the others had seen during their first outings. The ocean looked very green. Big icebergs floated here and there. Each of them, she said, looked like a pearl, and still they were a lot bigger than the church steeples that people built. They had the strangest shapes and glittered like diamonds. She sat on one of the biggest, and, terrified, all the ships went around the iceberg where she sat, and the wind blowing through her long hair. Later in the evening the sky became overcast. There was thunder and lightning, and black waves lifted up big blocks of ice so that they gleamed in bolts of red lightning. With fear and horror, deckhands pulled in the sails on every ship, but the mermaid sat calmly upon her floating iceberg and watched the blue lightning zigzag into the shiny sea. Whenever one of the sisters came to the surface for the first time, she would be thrilled by the new and beautiful things she had seen. But now that they were grown and were allowed to swim to the surface whenever they wished, they didn't care anymore. After a month of this, they wanted to be at home. They said that their own place down there was the most beautiful of all, and that it was so nice to be home. On many evenings, the 5 sisters linked arms and rose in a straight line to the surface. They had lovely voices, more beautiful than any human voice. And when a storm was coming, and they thought that ships might founder, they swam in front of the ships. They sang enchantedly about how beautiful it was on the bottom of the sea, and they told the sailors not to be afraid to go there. But the sailors didn't understand the words. They thought it was the storm, nor did they get to see the beauty down there, for when their ships sank, the sailors drowned. When they came to the castle of the Sea King, they were dead. In the evening, when the sisters rose up through the water, arm in arm, the youngest sister was left all alone, watching them go. She felt as if she were about to cry, but mermaids have no tears, so they suffer all the more. If only I were 15, she said, I know that I would love the world up above and the people who live there. At long last she turned 15. You're on your own now, said her grandmother. In the evening, when the sisters rose up through the water arm in arm, the youngest sister was left all alone, watching them go. She felt as if she were about to cry, but mermaids have no tears, so they suffer all the more. If only I were 15, she said, I know that I would love the world up above and the people who live there. At long last she turned 15. You're on your own now, said her grandmother, the old dowager queen. Come, let me dress you up like your sisters. She put a wreath of white lilies on the youngest sister's hair. Every petal in the flower was half a pearl, and the old lady clamped 8 big oysters on the princess's tail to show her high rank. It really hurts, the little mermaid cried. Well, there's no beauty without pain, the old woman replied. Oh, she would have liked to shake off all that finery, remove that heavy wreath. The red flowers from her garden would have looked much better on her, but she didn't dare change anything. Goodbye, she said, and the light and clear as a bubble she rose through the water. The sun had just set when she lifted her head above the surface, but the clouds still gleamed like roses and gold. The evening star shone brightly and beautifully in the middle of the pale red sky. The air was mild and fresh, and the sea was dead calm. She saw a big ship with 3 masts. Only one sail was up, because there was not so much as a breeze, and sailors sat around in the rigging and on the masts. There was music and song, and as the evening grew darker, hundreds of lamps in all kinds of colours were lit. It was as if the flags of all nations waved in the wind. The little mermaid swam right up to the port hole of the cabin, and every time a wave lifted her, she could see through the clear window pane. She saw lots of elegantly dressed people, but the most handsome of all was the young prince with big black eyes. He probably wasn't much older than 16. It was his birthday, and that's why there were all these festivities. As the young prince came out on the deck, where the sailors were dancing, more than 100 rockets were fired into the air. They made the sky as light as day and frightened the little mermaid. She dived under the water, but soon poked up her head, and it was as if all the stars in the sky were falling down on her. She had never seen such fireworks. Large suns whirled around, grand firefish glided through the blue air, and everything was reflected in the clear, calm sea. The ship itself was so brightly lit that you could see every little rope, and of course the people. How handsome the young prince was! He shook hands with everybody and laughed and smiled, while music filled the beautiful night. The night wore on, but the little mermaid could not turn away from the ship and the handsome prince. The coloured lamps were extinguished. No more rockets were fired into the air, and there were no more salutes from the cannon, but deep down the ocean groaned and growled. Through it all the little mermaid rode the waves up and down so that she could look into the cabin. But the ship picked up speed. One sail after another billowed out, and the waves rolled faster. Huge clouds gathered and lightning flashed in the distance. Terrible weather was coming. So the deadnecks took in the sails. The great ship rocked as it flew across the violent sea. The water rose like great dark mountains that could smash into the mast, and the ship dipped like a swan between the tall peaks before the towering waves lifted it again. The little mermaid thought it was fun to go fast, but the sailors didn't. The ship creaked and groaned, and its thick planks were bent by the powerful waves. The ocean crashed against the ship. The mast snapped like a reed, and the ship rolled onto its side as water rushed into its hold. Now the little mermaid saw that the sailors were in danger. She herself had to watch out for timber and pieces of the ship that floated on the water. One moment it was pitch dark, and she couldn't see a thing. Then, when lightning flashed, it got so bright that she recognized everybody on the ship. Everyone was thrashing about as best he could. Most of all, she looked for the young prince, and when the ship broke apart, she saw him sink into the deep ocean. At first she was happy, because now he was going to her world, but then she remembered that humans can't live in water, and that he could only come to her father's castle if he were dead. No, he mustn't die. So she swam among the beams and planks that drifted about on the water, not even thinking that they could crush her. She dived deep under the water and came up again, between the waves. Finally, she reached the young prince, who barely had the strength to keep swimming in the stormy sea. His arms and legs had begun to weaken. His beautiful eyes were closed, and he would have died if the little mermaid hadn't been there. She held his head above water and let the waves push them along. In the morning the nasty weather was gone. There wasn't a splinter left of the ship. The sun rose red and shiny from the water and seemed to bring colour back to the prince's cheeks, but his eyes stayed closed. The mermaid kissed his beautiful high forehead and brushed back his wet hair. She thought that he looked like the marble statue in her own little garden. She kissed him again and wished more than anything that he would live. She saw land ahead of her, high blue mountains whose tops, shiny with white snow, looked like swans huddled together. Down by the coast was a beautiful green forest, and in front of that was a church, or a cloister. She wasn't quite sure which, a building of some sort. Lemon and orange trees grew in the garden, and tall palm trees stood in front of the gate. Here the ocean formed a little bay. It was utterly calm, but very deep right up to the rock, where the fine white sand had washed ashore. The mermaid swam over there with the handsome prince, laid him down in the sand, and made sure to lift his head towards the warm sun. And lay him down, and made sure to lift his head towards the warm sun. The bells rang in the large white building, and a group of young girls walked through the garden. The little mermaid swam farther out, behind some tall rocks that jutted from the water. She covered her hair and chest with foam so that no one could see her face, and she watched to see who would help the poor prince. It wasn't long before a young girl came along. She looked quite alarmed, but only for a moment. Then she went to fetch other people, and the mermaid saw that the prince had come too, and that he smiled to everyone around him. Yet he did not smile to her, because of course he did not know that she had rescued him. She felt very sad, and when he was led into the big building, she dived sorrowfully into the water and headed home to her father's castle. The little mermaid had always been quiet and thoughtful, but now she was even more so. Her sisters asked what she had seen during her first time up there, but she didn't tell them anything. Often in the evening and morning she swam to the spot where she left the prince. She saw the fruit in the garden ripen and be picked. She saw the snow melt in all the tall mountains. But she did not see the prince, which was why she always went home even sadder. Her only consolation was to sit in her little garden and wrap her arms around the beautiful marble statue that looked like the prince. They spread over the path and wound their long stems and leaves into the branches of the trees, so that everything became quite dark. She didn't take care of her flowers. Her only consolation was to sit in her little garden and wrap her arms around the beautiful marble statue that looked like the prince. She didn't take care of her flowers, which grew into the wilderness. They spread over the path and wound their long stems and leaves into the branches of the trees, so that everything became quite dark. In the end, she couldn't stand it any longer, and told one of her sisters. Right away all of them knew, but nobody apart from them and a couple of other mermaids, who didn't say anything to anyone except their closest friends. One of them knew who the prince was. She too had seen the festive ship and knew where he came from and the whereabouts of his kingdom. "Come along, little sister," the other princesses said, and with their arms around each other's shoulders, they rose out of the water in a long row, where they knew the prince's castle stood. The castle was built with a kind of pale yellow, glistening stone. It had grand marble staircases, and one went all the way to the sea. Magnificent gilded cupolas arched above the roof and between the pillars, which surrounded the entire building, were lifelike marble statues. Through the clear glass of tall windows, you could see into majestic rooms with priceless tapestries and silk curtains. The walls were covered with large paintings, which were a pleasure to look at. A great fountain splashed in the middle of the biggest hall, and its spray reached high up towards a glass dome in the ceiling. The sun shone down to the water and on the beautiful plants that grew in the pool of the fountain. Now the little mermaid knew where the prince lived, and she would often go there in the evening and at night. She swam much closer to land than any of the others had dared. In fact, she went all the way to a small canal under a splendid marble balcony that cast its long shadow across the water. She sat there and gazed at the young prince, who thought that he was all alone in the bright moonlight. Many evenings she saw him sail off in his grand ship, with music playing and flags waving. She would peep through the green rushes, and if the wind lifted her long silver-white veil and you happened to see it, you would have thought it was a swan taking flight. Often at night, when the fishermen were out at sea with their flares, she heard them say lots of nice things about the young prince. It made her happy that she had saved him when he drifted half dead upon the waves, and she remembered how his head had rested tightly against her breast, and how lovingly she had kissed him. He didn't know anything about it, so he couldn't even dream about her. The little mermaid grew fonder and fonder of human beings, and more she wished that she could live among them. Their world, it seemed to her, was much bigger than hers. They could fly across the ocean in their ships, climb the tall mountains far above the clouds, and their land, covered with woods and fields, stretched farther than she could see. There was so much that she wanted to know, but her sisters didn't have an answer for everything. That was why she asked her old grandmother, who knew about the world, which she quite rightly called the lands above the sea. If people don't drown, the little mermaid asked, can they live forever? Don't they die as we do down here in the ocean? Yes, the old woman said, they have to die too, and their lifespan is even shorter than ours. We can live for 300 years, but when we stop existing, we turn into foam on the sea, and we don't even have a grave down here among our loved ones. We don't have an immortal soul. We won't ever live again. We're like the green rushes. Once they've been cut, they can't grow again. But humans have a soul, which lives forever, and it lives even after the body has turned to dust. It rises through the clear air into the shining stars, just as we swim to the surface of the ocean and see where people live. They go up to beautiful unknown places that we shall never get to see. Why didn't we get an immortal soul? The little mermaid asked sadly. I would give all my 300 years if I could be a human for just one day and get a place in the heavenly world. You shouldn't think about that sort of thing, the old woman said. We are much happier and better off than people up there. So that means that I'm going to die and float like foam on the ocean, and not hear the music of the waves or see the beautiful flowers in the red sun? Can't I do something to get an immortal soul? No, the old woman said. Only if a human being loved you so much that you meant more to him than his father or mother. No, the old woman said. Only if a human being loved you so much that you meant more to him than his father or mother, and only if all his thoughts and feelings were devoted to you, and he let the vicar put his hand in yours with the promise of faithfulness now and for all eternity. Then his soul would flow into your body, and you two could share human happiness. He would give you a soul and still keep his own, but that's never going to happen. The thing that's so wonderful in the sea, your fishtail, is considered hideous up on land. They don't know any better. To be beautiful up there, you need to have two clumsy pillars that they call legs. The little mermaid sighed and looked sadly at her fishtail. Let's be happy, the old woman said. Let's hop and skip for the 300 years that we live here. When you think about it, that's enough time. After that, we'll be glad to rest in our graves. Tonight we're going to have a dance at the castle. Everything looked more fabulous than anything you'll ever see on earth. Inside, the great ballroom walls and ceiling were made of thick but clear glass. Several hundred colossal mussel shells, rose red and grass green, were lined up on each side, each burning with a blue flame. They lit up the whole room and shone through the walls, illuminating the ocean outside. You could see countless fish, large and small, swim towards the glass wall. Some of their scales glowed scarlet, and others appeared to be silver and gold. A wide rushing stream flowed through the middle of the ballroom, and mermaids and mermen danced on the water to the sound of their own beautiful singing. No one on earth had such lovely voices. The little mermaid sang more beautifully than anyone. They clapped for her, and for a moment her heart was joyful, because she knew that she had the most beautiful voice of anyone on earth or in the sea. But soon she began to think again about the world above. She could not forget the handsome prince, or her sorrow at not having an immortal soul, as he did. That was why she sneaked out of her father's castle, and while it was all song and merriment inside, the little mermaid was sad in her little garden. She heard the sound of a horn through the water, and she thought, I'm sure he's out sailing, the one who means more to me than my father and mother, the one I can't stop thinking about, in whose hands I could put my life and happiness. I'd risk everything to win him, and an immortal soul. While my sisters dance in my father's castle, I'll go to the sea witch. I've always been afraid of her, but maybe she can give me advice and help me. The little mermaid left her garden and went to where the sea witch lived, behind the roaring maelstroms. The mermaid had never gone that way before. No flowers grew there, no seagrass, nothing but the naked, grey sandy bottom stretching towards the maelstroms, where the water, like the churning water wheel, whirled around and pulled everything it got hold of down to the depths. To reach the sea witch's district, the little mermaid had to go through these crashing whirlpools, and for a long stretch the only route was over the hot bubbling mud that the sea witch called her pet dog. Her house lay behind it in the middle of a peculiar forest. All the trees and bushes were sea polyps, half animal, half plant, and looked like 100-headed snakes growing from the earth. The branches were long slimy arms with fingers like slithering worms, and the joint for joint they undulated from their roots to the uppermost tips. They wound themselves around everything in the sea that they got hold of, and they never let go. The little mermaid became frightened as she stood there, her heart pounded with fear. She almost turned back. But then she thought about the prince and the human soul, and that gave her courage. She tied her long floating hair around her head so that the sea polyps couldn't grab it. She folded both hands across her chest, and like the fish that fly through the water, she darted in among the hideous sea polyps, which stretched their sinuous arms and fingers after her. She saw that each sea polyp held on to something that it had caught. Hundreds of little arms wound around their catch like strong iron bands. People who had died at sea and sunk to the bottom peeped like white skeletons through the arms of the sea polyps. The polyps held on to ship rudders, chests, the skeletons of animals, and also a small mermaid they had caught and strangled. That was almost the scariest thing for the little mermaid. She came to a large slimy clearing in the forest, where big fat water snakes gambolled and showed off their disgusting yellow-white undersides. In the middle of the clearing was a house built out of the white bones of shipwrecked humans. That was where the sea witch sat with a toad that she let eat out of her mouth, the way that people let a little canary eat a lump of sugar. She called the fat ugly water snakes her little chickens and let them frolic on her huge spongy chest. "I think I know what you want," the sea witch said. "You are being very unwise. You can have it your way, but it's going to bring you grief, my lovely princess. You want to get rid of your fish tail and replace it with 2 stumps to walk on, like a human, so the young prince will fall in love with you, and you will have him and an immortal soul." At that the sea witch laughed so loudly and nastily that the toad and snakes fell to the ground and rolled around. "You came just in time," the witch said. "After sunrise tomorrow I wouldn't have been able to help you for another year. I'll make you a drink, but before the sun comes up, you must swim to land, sit on the shore and drink it. Then your tail will split in 2 and shrink into what humans call pretty legs. But it hurts. It's like a sharp sword going through you. Everyone who sees you will say that you're the loveliest girl they have ever seen. You will keep your gliding walk. No dancer will soar like you. But every step you take will feel like you're stepping on a sharp knife that makes you bleed. If you're willing to suffer all this, I'll help you." "Yes," the little mermaid said in a quavering voice, and she thought about the prince and about winning an immortal soul. "But remember," the sea witch continued, "as soon as you get a human form, you can't ever be a mermaid again. You can never swim down through the water to your sister's and your father's castle. And unless you win the prince's love so that he forgets his father and mother for your sake and thinks only about you and lets the vicar put your hands together so that you become man and wife, you won't get an immortal soul." "The first morning after he has married someone else, your heart will break and you'll turn into foam on the sea." "I still want to do it," the little mermaid said. She was as pale as a corpse. "But you have to pay me too," the sea witch went on, "and I ask for quite a bit. You have the prettiest voice of anyone on the bottom of the sea, and I'm sure you imagine that you'll charm him, but you have to give me that voice. I want the most precious thing from you. I want the most precious thing you own for my precious drink. As you know, I have to add my blood to make the drink as sharp as a double-edged sword." "But if you take my voice," the little mermaid said, "what will I have left?" "Your beautiful figure," the witch said, "your soaring walk and your eloquent eyes. With all that you can certainly enchant a human heart." "Well, well, have you lost a heart? Stick out your little tongue, then I'll cut it off as a payment, and you'll get my powerful drink." "Do it," the little mermaid said, and the sea witch put on the kettle to cook the magic potion. "Cleanliness is next to godliness," the sea witch said. She scoured the kettle with one of the snakes, which she tied into a knot. Then she cut her chest and let her black blood drip down. The steam made the oddest shapes, enough to make anyone anxious and afraid. Every other moment the witch added something new to the kettle, and when it reached full boil, it sounded like a crocodile shedding tears. At last the drink was done, and it looked like the clearest water. "Here's your drink," the witch said, and cut off the little mermaid's tongue. Now she was mute and could neither sing nor speak. "In case the sea polyps grab you when you return through my forest," the sea witch explained, "just throw a single drop of this potion on them, and their arms and fingers will explode into 1,000 pieces." But the little mermaid didn't need to. When the sea polyps saw the luminous drink that glowed in her hand like a radiant star, they retreated in fear. She quickly got through the forest, the bog, and the whirling maelstrom. The mermaid could see her father's castle. The torches in the great ballroom had been extinguished. They were probably all asleep. She didn't dare go to look for them, though, not when she was mute and was going to leave them forever. Her heart felt as if it would break from sorrow. She crept into the garden, took one flower from each of her sister's flower beds, tossed 1,000 kisses towards the castle, and swam up through the dark blue sea. The sun had not yet risen when she saw the prince's castle and climbed the magnificent marble stairs. The moon was bright and clear. The little mermaid drank the fiery, acrid drink, and it felt like a double-edged sword going through her delicate body. She fainted and lay there as if she were dead. When the sun shone down on the ocean, she awoke and felt a stinging pain. But right in front of her was a handsome young prince. He stared at her with his coal black eyes, and she lowered hers and saw that her fishtail was gone. She had the prettiest slender white legs that any young girl could want, but she was naked, so she wrapped herself in her thick long hair. The prince asked who she was and how she had got there. With a gentle yet sad expression, she looked at him with her dark blue eyes. She couldn't speak, of course. He held her by the hand and led her into the castle. Every step she took felt like stepping on piercing needles and sharp knives, as the sea witch had predicted, but she endured it gladly. With the prince holding her hand, she moved as lightly as a bubble, and the prince and everyone was amazed by her lovely floating walk. They dressed her in precious clothes made of silk and muslin. She was more beautiful than anyone in the castle, but she was mute, could neither sing nor speak. Gorgeous slave girls dressed in silk and gold came out and sang for the prince and his royal parents. One sang more beautifully than all the rest, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. Then the little mermaid felt sad, because she knew that she had once sung much more beautifully. She thought, "Oh, if only he knew that I had given away my voice for all eternity just to be with him." The slave girls performed a charming gliding dance to the most glorious music. The little mermaid lifted her beautiful white arms, rose up on the tips of her toes, and floated across the floor, dancing as no one had ever danced. Every moment made her loveliness more apparent, and her eyes spoke more deeply to the heart than the song of the slaves. Everyone was enraptured by her dance, especially the prince, who called her his little foundling. She danced again and again, although every time her foot touched the ground, it felt as if she was stepping on very sharp knives. The prince said that she should stay with him always, and she was allowed to sleep outside his door on a velvet cushion. He had a boy's costume sewn for her so that she could go riding with him. They rode through sweet-smelling forests where green branches brushed against her shoulders, and little birds sang behind new leaves. She climbed the highest mountains with the prince, and although her delicate feet bled so much that everyone could see it, she laughed it off and followed the prince, until below them they saw clouds sailing by like a flock of birds on their way to foreign lands. At night in the prince's castle, while everybody was asleep, the little mermaid went out onto the wide marble stairs. It cooled her burning feet to stand in the cold sea water. That was when she thought about those down there in the deep. One night her sisters came to her, arm in arm. They sang sorrowfully as they swam above the water. She waved to them, and they recognized her and told her how unhappy she had made them. From then on they visited her every night, and one night, far out at sea, she saw her old grandmother, who had not come to the surface for many years, and she saw the Sea King with his crown on his head. They stretched out their hands to her, but didn't dare come as close to shore as her sisters had. Day by day the prince grew fonder of the little mermaid. He loved her as one loves a dear sweet child, but it never occurred to him to make her his queen. Yet she had to become his wife to get an immortal soul, or else, on the morning of his wedding, she would turn into foam on the sea. "Don't you love me more than anyone else?" the little mermaid's eyes seemed to ask when he took her in his arms and kissed her beautiful forehead. "Yes, you're the one dearest to me," the prince said, "because you have the noblest heart of all. You're the one most devoted to me, and you remind me of a young girl I once saw, but probably will never find again. I was aboard a ship that sank. The waves carried me ashore near a holy temple, where several young girls served. The youngest one found me on the beach and saved my life. I saw her twice. She's the only one in the world I could love. But you look like her, and you almost make me forget the picture I keep of her in my mind. She belongs to the holy temple. That explains the good luck that brought you to me. We'll never be separated." "He doesn't know that I saved his life," the little mermaid thought. "I carried him across the sea to the forest where the temple stands. I sat there covered with foam and watched to see if someone would come. I saw the beautiful girl he loves more than me." The little mermaid sighed deeply because she couldn't cry. "The girl belongs to the holy temple," he told me. "She'll never come out into the world. They'll never meet again. I'm here with him. I see him every day. I'll take care of him, love him, devote my life to him." But then people said the prince was going to marry the beautiful daughter of the neighboring king, which was why he was fitting out such a splendid ship. They said that the prince was going to visit the neighbour king's country, but that really he was going to see the king's daughter. He took along a large entourage. The little mermaid shook her head and laughed. She knew the prince's thoughts much better than all the rest of them. "I have to leave," he said to her. "I have to meet the beautiful princess. My parents insist on it, but they won't make me bring her back as my bride. I can't love her. She doesn't look like the beautiful girl in the temple that you remind me of. When I have to choose a bride someday, it's much more likely to be you, my silent foundling with the eloquent eyes." He kissed her red mouth, played with her long hair, and laid his head against her heart, so that she dreamed about human happiness and an immortal soul. "You're not the least bit afraid of the sea, my silent child," he said, when they were aboard the great ship that was going to take him to the neighbour king's land. He told her about stormy seas and dead calm, about strange fish in the deep, and what divers had seen. She smiled at his tale, because of course she knew a lot more than anyone about the bottom of the sea. During the moonlit night, when everyone slept except for the officer who stood at the helm, the mermaid sat by the ship's railing and stared down through the clear water, imagining that she saw her father's palace. On the top floor, her old grandmother, wearing a silver crown on her head, was staring at the ship's bow through the rushing water. Then her sisters came to the surface. They stared at her sadly and wrung their white hands. She waved to them, smiled, and wanted to tell them that she was happy and everything was going well. But the cabin boy approached her, and her sisters dived down so that he would think that the whiteness he had seen was foam on the sea. The next morning the ship sailed into the harbour of the neighbour king's magnificent city. All the church bells rang, and from high towers trumpeters played fanfares, while soldiers passed by with waving banners and gleaming bayonets. There were celebrations every day, parties and balls, one after another. But the princess had not come yet. She was being taught in a holy temple far away, people said. She was learning all the royal virtues. Finally she arrived. The little mermaid stood there, eager to see the princess's beauty, and she had to admit that she had never seen anyone so lovely. Her skin was soft and smooth, and a pair of deep blue loving eyes smiled behind her long dark eyelashes. "It's you," the prince said, "you who saved me when I lay half dead on the shore." He held his blushing bride tightly in his arms. "Oh, I'm far too happy," he said to the little mermaid. "The best thing that I have ever dared to hope for has been granted to me. You will be happy that I am so happy, because you love me best of all." The little mermaid kissed his hand and felt that her heart was ready to break. His wedding morning, of course, would mean her death, and she would turn into foam on the sea. The church bells rang, and heralds rode through the streets, announced the engagement. On every altar, sweet-scented oil burned in precious silver lamps. Priests swung their censers, and the bride and bridegroom held each other's hands and received the bishop's blessing. The little mermaid, dressed in silk and gold, held the bride's train. But her ears didn't hear the festive music. Her eyes didn't see the holy ceremony. She thought about the night of her death and about everything in this world that she had lost. That very evening the bride and bridegroom went aboard the ship. Cannons boomed, flags waved, and in the middle of the ship was a grand tent of purple and gold, with the finest cushions. That was where their newlyweds were to sleep in the silent, cool night. The sails swelled in the wind, and the ship glided smoothly over the glassy sea. When it got dark, lamps in many colours were lit, and the sailors danced merry reels on deck. The little mermaid couldn't help thinking about the first time she had swum up through the ocean and seen the same splendour and gaiety. She whirled into the dance, gliding like a swallow. Everyone cheered and applauded with admiration. She had never danced so gloriously. It was as if sharp knives were cutting her delicate feet, but she didn't feel it. The pain that pierced her heart was far worse. She knew that this was the last night that she would see the prince, the one for whom she had left her family and home, given up her beautiful voice, and suffered endless torment every day without his knowing it. It was the last night that she would breathe the same air as he, that she would see the deep ocean and the starry blue sky. Eternal night, without thoughts or dreams, awaited her, she who didn't have a soul and who could not win one. Aboard the ship, merriment and celebration continued long past midnight. The mermaid laughed and danced, her heart filled with the thoughts of death. The prince kissed his lovely bride, and she played with his black hair. Arm in arm they went to rest in the magnificent tent. The ship fell silent and still. Only the officer stood by the helm. The little mermaid rested her white arms on the railing and looked for dawn in the east, knowing that the sun's first ray would kill her. Then she saw her sisters rise out of the sea. They were as pale as she was. Their long, beautiful hair no longer waved in the wind. It had been cut off. "We gave it to the witch so that she could help you, so that you don't have to die tonight. She gave us a knife. Here it is. Do you see how sharp? Before the sun rises, you must stab the prince's heart with it. When his warm blood splatters on your feet, they'll grow together into a fishtail, and you'll become a mermaid again. Dive into the water with us and live your 300 years before you turn into the dead, salty foam on the sea. Hurry up. He or you must die before the sun rises." Our old grandmother is so grief-stricken that her white hair has fallen out, just as ours fell into the witch's scissors. "Kill the prince and come back. Hurry. Do you see the red streak in the sky? In just a few minutes the sun will rise, and you will die." They let out a strangely deep sigh and sank down into the waves. The little mermaid pulled aside the tense purple curtain and saw the beautiful bride asleep with her head on the prince's chest. She bent down, kissed his handsome forehead, and looked up, where the red sky of morning became brighter and brighter. Then she looked at the sharp knife and fastened her eyes again on the prince, who, as he dreamed, said his bride's name aloud. She was the only one in his thoughts. The knife trembled in the mermaid's hands, but then she threw it far out into the waves, which glowed red where it fell, and it looked as if drops of blood were bubbling up through the water. Once more she looked at the prince, her eyes dying, and then she leaped from the ship into the sea and felt her body dissolve into foam. The sun rose from the sea, its rays falling with mildness and warmth on the dead cold sea foam. The little mermaid did not feel death. She saw the bright sun. The hundreds of beautiful transparent beings floated above her. She could see them through the ship's white sail and the red clouds in the sky. Their voices were a melody, but so spirit-like that no human ear could hear them, just as no earthly eye could see them. They soared through the air without wings, on their own lightness. The little mermaid saw that she had a body like theirs. It rose higher and higher from the foam. "To whom am I coming?" she asked, and her voice sounded like the other beings, so spirit-like that no earthly music could sound like it. "To the daughters of the air," the others replied. "A mermaid has no immortal soul and can never get one unless she wins the love of a human being. Her eternal life depends on another power. The daughters of the air don't have immortal souls either, but they can earn them through their good deeds. We fly to hot countries where warm, pestilential air kills people. We fan in coolness there. We spread the scent of flowers through the air and bring relief and healing. When we've struggled for 300 years to do what good we can, we'll get an immortal soul, as people do, and enjoy eternal happiness. Your poor little mermaid, you've struggled with your entire heart for the same thing we have. You've suffered and endured, and you've come to the world of spirits of the air. By doing good deeds, you too can win an immortal soul in 300 years. The little mermaid lifted her clear arms towards God's sun, and for the first time she felt tears. On the ship, noise and life had returned. The mermaid saw that the prince and his beautiful bride were looking for her, staring sadly at the frothy foam, as if they knew that she had thrown herself into the waves. The mermaid, invisible, kissed the bride's forehead, smiled to the prince, and with the other children of the air rose into the pink clouds which sailed across the sky. "In 300 years we will sail like that into God's kingdom. We might get there sooner," one of them whispered. "We float invisibly into people's houses where children live. Every time we find a good child who makes his parents happy and deserves their love, God will shorten our trials. A child won't know when we fly through the room, but if we can smile with joy at the child, a year will be taken away from the 300. But when we see a naughty and mean child, it makes us cry tears of sorrow, and every day and every tear adds a day to our trials." I hope you enjoyed this story. Please like and subscribe to my channel, Cozy Toes ASMR.